without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our authors for this evening. First up, we have Joanna Eleftheriou, who's an assistant professor of English at Christopher Newport University, a contributing editor of Essay, a journal of nonfiction studies, and a faculty member at the writing workshops in Greece. Her essays, short stories, and translations appear regularly in journals including Appalachia Review, Chautauqua, Cut Bank, Arts and Letters, and The Common. Based in Hampton Roads, Virginia, she regularly spends time in New York, Cyprus, and Greece. Her first book, the essay collection This Way Back, is out now and available at Green Apple. Please welcome Joanna Eleftheriou. And David Lazar's essays and prose poems have appeared widely in such publications as Gulf Coast and Quarterly, the anthologies Bending Genres and Understanding the Essay, and 6 of his essays have been notable essays of the year, according to Best American Essays. His books include After Montaigne, Interviews and Conversations with MFK Fisher, and Who's Afraid of Helen of Troy, among others. A leader in the genre of creative nonfiction, he created the undergraduate and PhD programs in nonfiction writing at Ohio University and directed the creation of the undergraduate and MFA programs in nonfiction writing, Columbia College, Chicago. He's the founding editor of the literary magazine Hotel America. His latest book, Celeste Holm Syndrome, on character actors from Hollywood's golden age, is the reason we're here this evening. So please join me in welcoming David Lazar.
Thank you, everyone. I'm super excited to be reading with David Lazar tonight, whose work I've admired for many years, both as a scholar of nonfiction and, of course, as an essayist. Thank you to the legendary Green Apple Books. I want to say that the work of bookstores is even more vital today than ever. We pandemic authors putting our books out in the pandemic are more grateful than we can say for the way your physical and your virtual presence anchor our literary communities. I'm going to read part of my book's first essay for about 10 minutes or so. David and I, in our books, in our new books, both look at our father's stories, and we both think about the way, as writers and as a son and a daughter, we memorialize them in our writing and in our lives. And we find our place in the world after our father's characters have left the stage. This is from A Rope of Desires. After we had viewed the summer before the house he would eventually buy, my father asked my opinion. I disagree, I said to him, for the first time in my life. I was 33. But you're 100% Greek, he argued, insisting this identity should cause me to support a purchase that no one considered wise. My love of Greek music and literature, along with the Greek landscape's hold over my imagination, should have made me sympathetic. I countered, isn't Dino Greek too? My brother and I have the same parents. No, he said, dismissing my appeal to fact, perhaps annoyed that I was ignoring other facts, that my brother took an interest in business, listened to American music, and watched television, and didn't return to our island after college or share with my father and me a certain way of being in the world that is ruminative and nostalgic. Dino is an American, my father said, ending the argument. He looked at me like I had betrayed something, not him so much as something he knew was in me, something he had given me and only me. That look of betrayal recalled a time 3 years before when he had just sold off all the property to which he had a title deed, having accepted bad offers because he wanted so badly to leave. This place has embittered me, he said in Greek many times. Me pikrane avtos o topos. He'd been betrayed by the happiness of his youthful memories and by the promises of the land he had inherited, large swaths of it from his parents. Together, memories and land promised him a happiness he never found when he returned. I never understood what it was my father wanted. He wanted so much at once, for all his children to live in Cyprus, for us all to be in New York with the extended family, where his parents were buried, to teach history, and to grow enough food for a family, to be surrounded by us, and to be alone. He asked his 3 children to visit him in the hospital, as though he wanted to have us around when he passed, but when we arranged flights to Cyprus, he eluded us and died alone. On St. George's Day, April 23rd, he eluded even my mother, Georgia, slipping away in the wee hours of the night, just after she had left the hospital to get a little sleep at home. I learned nothing in the end but this: that human desire is a rope, one braided with thickly conflicting wants. And so my father kept on shepherding his wife and children to Cyprus and then out of it. He longed for life on a mountaintop, and when he got it, left for proximity to schools. He longed for the spoils of modernity, the city, sweatless intellectual work, emancipation from the backbreaking demands of livestock and crops. And when he got that, becoming a teacher in New York City schools, he longed for gardens, grew vegetables in New York and then in Cyprus. He harvested a whole field of potatoes by hand. He wanted his children to be independent, joyful adults, but he begged me to pick up where he had left off, complete his grad school research, embody his desires, make my life a realization of his abandoned dreams. Young Andreas's journals document a resistance to the land, but the stones of the memorial I would eventually have built for him document a desire to return. My father's teenage voice laments the holidays when he is stuck in the village. He cannot do the teenage things he enjoys when he's in the city for school: rehearsals with the drama club, volleyball matches, walks on the seafront. The 2 volumes he left for us to find document his last years of high school, 1957 until 1959. On the first pages, he is 17 and sick of being stuck in the village. For a year, the British colonial government had closed Lannition Secondary School in retribution for the city students' agitation for the colony's unification with Greece. My father writes of being miserable without class and without his friends, just as I would be, in those same hills 40 years on when school was out. A few pages in, the schools are permitted to reopen, and my father is once again staying in the city with his aunt. He notes in his diary the nights on which he went to the cinema, often earning his ticket by serving as an usher. One of the theaters, the Rialto, closed for decades, and when the area around it, the Plaza of Heroes, became a red light district. Now, a university has opened nearby, and dorms and cafes have reverted the area to the way it was in my father's youth. And with my own friends, I have been to the Rialto often for films, concerts, and plays. In the summer, we've sat on the steps of the Plaza of Heroes outside the Rialto for an international music festival. I'm the only one of his children who can read his teenage scrawl. Old men reminisce to me, after my father's funeral, about having once plowed land for my father's landowning family. They told me of driving teams of oxen and of the lunches my grandmother often sent for them at noon. Then my grandfather paid them meager wages and pocketed the surplus after paying, too, heavy British taxes. In the years after my family moved away, those same once hired men and tenant farmers went to work at the electrical plant nearby, or at a gravel quarry, or on construction sites for hotels. They made more money than my teacher parents and built houses larger than ours because they could build them with their own hands and the hands of relatives and friends. In the time my father spent away, being the son of a large landowner had changed its meaning, and he inherited his parents' tracts of earth, but none of the old ceremonial respect that they had enjoyed. He paid taxes and hired tractors to plow to prevent wildfires. But I don't know whether my father ever reckoned with the way land ownership had once afforded a privilege he could not appreciate until it was gone. Yet even after the disillusionment about what a plot of stony earth could yield, even after my father took his whole family back to America because he had been, by the earth's promises, disappointed, the earth on which he was born kept calling. And I feel it too. Desire for that earth. I long for my village even though what I most desire is the academic job I've got. Even though I was half grown when I arrived and still young when I left, because even though the earth has stopped being able to promise that it will feed us, even though land ownership no longer gives us power over our neighbors, the earth still pulls us towards it with its promise that it can lend to us a permanent home. My father's last years of high school coincided with the end of Cyprus's guerrilla war against British control, and the freedom fighters' appeal for union with Greece was met with a compromise of independent statehood. In the text he left behind, events that would later be recalled as landmarks of Cypriot history punctuate the daily accounts of schoolwork and fun. The assassination of Eleftheriou, the militia's second in command, the Zurich-London Treaty, release of political prisoners, the return of Archbishop Makarios, who had been exiled by the British to the Seychelles, independence. All these events, which are now the backbone of Cypriot history, are recorded in tandem with a tally of girls cited, kebabs and ice cream eaten, movies seen, and the number of points scored in basketball and volleyball games. Men who fought for independence are released from British captivity on the day my father did poorly on a physics test, but well in geography. News of passports and developments, first with getting to Australia, then to America, also enter his pages, with only enough comment to suggest the same ambivalence I feel when nearing any graduation. The eager anticipation of freedom mixed with regret, a premature nostalgia for the soon-to-be lost sweetness of being a senior, a person who has mastered the art of high school or college or graduate school. Once the warm weather comes, my father studies for exams between eating ice cream and watching open-air film screenings. On the last day of his final exam, he wrote, "Today is the last day of my school life, της μαθητικής μου ζωής." With that ending came also the end of bicycle riding, of promenading with movie going, of serenading girls from under their windows. Upon graduation, young Andreas was sent back to Asgata to help with the carob harvest, plant lentils and pick oranges, restock the family grocery store with sugar and beer, and oversee the tilling of the fields. By the time Andreas graduated high school, his father had already emigrated to America and was working in New York as a sous chef. The father writes him letters with directions which he records, but does not obey. The journal concludes with this line, "Μου έστειλε $10 ο πατέρας. Με προτρέπει να πάω στο χωριό. My father sent me $10. He urges me to go back to the village." Thank you, David.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joanna. That was great. The reason I asked Joanna Eleftheriou to read with me tonight is because her new book is such a wonderful book of essays, and I do stress essays. It's distinctly a book of linked essays, and it moves and thinks with the soul of the essay, and so my congratulations to you. So we'll have some things to talk about in a few minutes. So I'm going to read an essay about my father, the dead white male, and the actor Martin Balsam. For those of you who don't know who Martin Balsam is, you in fact can peek at your phones and find a picture of them. Since I can't see you, I won't be offended. The name of the essay is Martin Balsam, the Best Possible Arnold Burns. He was born in 1919 to an Eastern European Jewish family in New York. His parents, immigrants, Yiddish speaking, and graduated from DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx. He was in the military in World War II and served in the 3rd Theater, the Pacific Asian Theater, which encompassed the war in the Pacific, Japan, the Philippines, and so on, but also Australia and India for support services. He rose to the rank of sergeant. After the war demobbed, he returned to New York. He longed to hear his parents' Yiddish again. There are probably a few dozen men who fit this description, but two of them are my father and the character actor Martin Balsam, who appeared in dozens of films and won an Academy Award in 1965 for A Thousand Clowns. They knew each other well, though I'm not sure if they knew each other in high school. They did not serve together in the war, but I remember my father talking about Marty from a reasonably early age. My father, who owned a thriving travel agency in Midtown Manhattan, Comet Travel Service. I came up with the name when I was 5 because comets are fast. That served the garment industry. Had many celebrity clients over the years, Perry Como, Shirley Bassey, Danny Kaye. It was New York, and my father over the years, through his charm and ability to hustle, through sheer indomitable will, established himself as a person in the travel business who could get the tough ticket, the difficult reservation, which was useful to almost everyone, an eminently tradable skill. And reputation, as we know, becomes tradable itself. So once my father had established that reputation, it built on itself, and he became in certain circles a, shall we say, figure of some repute. I feel like I should be Keenan Wynn saying this in a pinstriped suit, though my father was no Ed Wynn. In other words, a character. To add to this, my father, in the pursuit of airline tickets, hotel reservations, whatever arrangements he needed to make for his clients, and then whatever arrangements he needed to make for his son's insatiable need for concert tickets and the family's desire for tickets to Broadway shows, turned himself at some point, plastic and fungible, and into an actor who could get what he needed for himself and others. I've written elsewhere about my child's eye version of this, my father's John Waterman phone in his office, first on West 37th Street, and then for many years on West 33rd Street across from Madison Square Garden. The John Waterman phone was a phone in my father's office that we were instructed never to pick up, that my father would use to play any character he needed to get what he wanted, usually for a client. If a hotel was booked or a flight, my father would be governmental, perhaps the mayor's deputy. People couldn't check things as much 50 years ago, or some other flight of fancy he had, a famous Australian thespian, the visiting mayor of Bismarck, North Dakota. My father loved to do accents. That was part of his character actor's shtick. Martin Balsam, the character actor, had a bland, almost generic American accent. It makes sense that he was the original voice of the HAL 9000 computer in 2001: A Space Odyssey. I can just hear his voice saying, "Dave." And it's too bad that Kubrick replaced it. It sounded too American to him, because I would have forever loved that connection. Balsam, friend of my father from the Bronx, and through Kubrick, my name spoken to freaked out Keir Dullea. But none of the hallmarks of Balsam's most interesting career as a character actor, one of the hallmarks, is the way he falls between the two classic modes of great character actors. Quirky personalities imprinted on most roles, no matter how different, or the disappearing of the individual into a distinctly different character each time. He was neither, or perhaps a kind of strange combination of the two. He brought a kind of indistinct character to each role that seemed vaguely familiar, but was like a theme with variations. My father used to refer to him as Marty, and after Marty moved from New York to California, he would call my father once a week or so, and they would speak Yiddish to each other. And now I'm hearing the HAL 9000 voice say my name with a Yiddish inflected accent. When he needed a ticket, his assistant would call. I never met him or talked to him, unlike the many other actors who were clients of my father that I got the opportunity to drool over in my childhood. And that's it. That's about all I know of the connection between these two sergeants, these characters, other than a story my brother reminded me of. which I'd forgotten. After doing so many films of such high quality, Psycho, still probably his best known role, though small, as the detective Arbogast, who dies at the hand of Anthony Perkins' mother in a famous tracking shot down the stairs. On the waterfront, 12 Angry Men, Breakfast at Tiffany's, Cape Fear, 7 Days in May, Catch 22, Little Big Man, Balsam, who also had an extensive TV resume, was offered bags of money to co-star with Carol O'Connor in Archie's Place, the spin-off continuation of All in the Family, starring Carol O'Connor. After a year, apparently, he was bored with it and asked my father if he thought he should stay. My father predictably told him he would be an idiot to walk away from so much dough. My father had many virtues, but a reasonable perspective on the value of money was not one of them. The house I grew up in, for some reason, I have an unseasonable nostalgia for that phrase, the house I grew up in, with its dangling prepositions suggesting so many possibilities, in thrall with movies, in constant anxiety about what kind of bizarre creature I was, in a surfeit of melancholy about whether I was loved or would be, and so on. Not to mention how house functions like a clinging vine of nostalgia, extending to so many associations that our enclosures represent psychologically, emotionally, somatically, was to some extent governed by sayings, a combination of cliches and epigrams pulled from familial experience. One that my father repeated often was, "It all comes down to money." Free-thinking, anti-capitalist teenager that I was, I hated it. I recently suggested ruefully to my brother, as we contemplated the inscription on my father's headstone, that we write, "It all comes down to money." He seemed amused. If you have older siblings, you understand how much of the psychic energy of your lives comes from the discipline of trying to amuse them. In any case, Martin Balsam, after a long career of roles, walked away from the one that was particularly bland. None of this would matter if I weren't interested in Balsam in some way, if I didn't find something interesting or essential about some of his performances. The quality or qualities I've always been most intrigued by are most represented by his award-winning role in 1,000 Clowns, where he plays the brother of protagonist Murray Burns, played by Jason Robards, Arnold Burns. 1,000 Clowns is really a dated film in many ways, with its vague and sentimental ideology of pre-1960s dropout bliss, combined with a kind of curdled New York cynicism. It's at times delightful and at times somewhat distasteful. As is frequently, if not inevitably true of great character actor performances, Balsam has many good and one great scene. He plays the straight foil to his unconventional brother Murray, Jason Robards. Arnold is the manager to his writer brother, the creative, quirky, and unpredictable sibling who, rejecting the compromises of commercial TV, has dropped out. I have to digress briefly before talking about Balsam's big scene to mention the character performance of Gene Saks in 1,000 Clowns. Saks, who went on to an astonishing 7 Tony nominations, winning 3 for directing, here plays a children's TV host who is desperately unfunny and bleeds neurosis. It's a strange and very funny performance, one of the great demonstrations of tonal inversion, the comedy of being unfunny, like the tragedy of alexithymia, the inability to experience emotion. Saks as Leo, who plays Chuckles the chipmunk on TV, berates Barry Gordon's Nick, Murray and Arnold's nephew, for telling him how sad and unfunny he is, as though the rudeness of the boy's honesty were some kind of elixir that could cancel out the essence of its truth. It's a scene worthy of Beckett, really, thanks to Saks. Martin Balsam's Arnold has been trying to persuade Murray, his brother, to take any job, including writing for Sad Leo again, just to have some income so he can show he's fit to keep custody of his nephew. In other words, he pitches the virtues of compromise and sacrifice. Very square. In one scene, he breaks down laughing against his will at Murray's description of having left one potential employer flat-footed. This is 1965 on film. Herb Gardner's play, 1,000 Clowns, debuted on Broadway in 1962. And Jason Robards' Murray is a prototypical and early 60s free spirit. I would have loved to have seen that, Arnold says. It must have been great. I wish to God I didn't enjoy you so much. But the central scene is later the same day, after Murray has walked out of Arnold's office and blown the interview with Chuckles that Arnold, that Balsam, has worked so hard to salvage so that Murray could once again write for the sad clown. Balsam, eager to confront Jason Robards' Murray, seeks him out and confronts him. You said I insulted you, Roberts said, trying to get a rise out of his too tolerant brother. Please, please have an argument with me. But Arnold is eternally mollifying and wants Murray to try again. Arnold responds with a long monologue defending his resistance to conformity. As he walks away, Balsam shouts his name. It's really an ejaculation, and says, "Ooh, I scared myself." What follows is probably the best minute of Balsam's career and the reason he won the Academy Award. Balsam delivers Herb Gardner's moving and unconvincing defense of mediocrity. He says, I have a wife and I have children, and business, as they say, is business. I'm not an exceptional man, so it's possible for me to stay with things the way they are. I'm lucky. I'm gifted. I have a talent for surrender. And I like you, Murray. It makes me sad. You don't have the gift, and I can see the torture of it. All I can do is worry for you, but I will not worry for myself. You can't convince me that I'm one of the bad guys. I get up, I go, I lie a little, I peddle a little, I watch the rules, I talk the talk. We fellows have those offices high up there so we can catch the wind and go with it however it blows. But, and I'm not going to apologize for it, I take pride. I'm the best possible Arnold Burns. The scene is on YouTube, so I urge you to go watch it. It's riveting and captures Martin Balsam's great ability to be a distinct, even a perfect everyman, to explore the boundary between normalcy and idiosyncrasy. Balsam had a round face, a receding hairline. He looked like the eternal model for Willy Loman or your accountant. That actually meant he could play an endless variety of middle-aged roles, frequently roles in which the character is in some ways blocked, defeated, stymied. His look was the opposite of heroic, though it wasn't, as he says in his 1,000 Clowns speech, the stuff of intense antagonists. He could be memorably rueful or slightly pathetic at his best. As Mr. Longman, Mr. Green, in The Taking of Pelham 123, Balsam is a nervous, down on his luck motorman, and ironically, the one hijacker to escape. We aren't sure who to root for at the end. Walter Matthau as the cop, or the guy, Balsam, in his robe with a cold. Usually he played highly articulate roles. Like my father and many other New York ethnic borough kids, Balsam clearly valued speech. Think of Frank Sinatra's brilliant, innovative lyrical articulation of the 50s. I remember my own efforts to rid myself of my Brooklyn accent in my mid-teens, when even other kids with Brooklyn accents commented on how pronounced mine was. Quite a feat. But of course, not every character actor flattens out their accent. Many, in fact, trade on the uniqueness of it. Sheldon Leonard, Thelma Ritter. Balsam had studied at the dramatic workshop at New York with Erwin Piscator, and right after the war, Elia Kazan asked him to join the New Actors Studio. How heady it must have been for a young Jewish actor post-war to have been an innkeeper in the Living Christ series, an early TV series about the life of Jesus, or to be cast as Gillette, the investigator in Kazan's On the Waterfront. In 1957, he was one of the jurors in 12 Angry Men, though in truth, Balsam's role as foreman, somewhat halting, pretty reasonable, isn't the first that comes to mind. This is emblematic for Martin Balsam, always good, serving character, not usually the first thing that pops into memory when you try to think of performances that turned your head. Of course, there is Arbogast. In Psycho, Balsam, as the detective hired to pursue the disappearance of Janet Leigh, has one of the most famous death scenes in cinema. When I speak to people about actors, about character actors, quite frankly, most people don't know Balsam. They ask what he was in, and after the first few films I mention, a vague film of memory seems to form that solidifies, perhaps, with Arbogast, which takes me aback considering the number of films he had supporting roles in, more recently than many character actors who seem to have stayed more durably in memory. It's because I think his performances were so unquirky, quite different from undistinguished. But Arbogast will always be something of a calling card. If you remember, Arbogast, thinking he must talk to Anthony Perkins' mother, has gone to the Bates house and is walking up the stairs, hoping to meet mother. Bernard Herrmann's music is cueing us the whole way, through his strained strings, that this is not a good situation. The subjective point of view jumps from Arbogast to the objective view, a boom shot from the top of the stairs of him climbing, an objective view of a door opening, increasing our sense of dread. Suddenly the door flies open, at which point Hitchcock switches radically, briefly, to an overhead shot of Perkins' mother running out of the room and stabbing Arbogast. The camera then focuses on Arbogast Balsam's face, bloodied with cuts, eyes wide open, mouth open, stunned arms waving like a bird, flailing and falling backward down the stairs in a tracking shot, as Bernard Herrmann's famous Psycho strings accompany Arbogast's downfall. After he lands at the bottom, the knife is lifted high for an isolated shot, held for just an instant, then plunged, and we hear his muffled scream. And the scene ends. It's one of the most shocking and memorable deaths in cinema. And I think it's so memorable because, in a sense, Balsam, to his credit, both is and isn't. He isn't the protagonist. He isn't good looking or young or promising. He's a middle-aged guy doing his job, and he's very much in the wrong place. This death both complements and contrasts with Janet Leigh's. She's the beautiful woman symbolically being punished for her guilt. Arbogast's death is every man meeting a kind of existential chaos. His physiognomy, his unthreatening, reasonable countenance makes the violence done to him all the more horrific. And Balsam's open-mouthed, fish-like terror has the verite of someone caught in a real nightmare. My father told me the story of three men coming into his office and putting a gun to his head. They wanted to know where his cash was. My father always dealt with a lot of cash, and once a week it had to be deposited. Someone must have tipped them off. He said he didn't know what to do. He really needed to deposit that cash. For years, he was just a deposit away from financial ruin. So he acted a feint. Is an acted feint a feint, F-E-I-N-T? He just dropped to the floor as though he were out cold. Astonishingly, his act worked. The men left. I'm still a little stunned when I think of this story, partly in gratitude for my father's improvisatory skill, his thinking on his feet, and partly for the lack of persistence of those three stooges who gave up so easily. I mean, in the movies, by this time in the 60s, they would have picked him up and roughed him up a little, right? They would have said something like, not so fast. But life isn't the movies. How often I need to remind myself of that. Sometimes, briefly, things end well. Arbogast, the name is more memorable than the man. Arbogasp is literally a fall guy, part of the MacGuffin plot. He reminds us that bad things happen to neutral people, to everyone. Balsam was a character actor who played a lot of men whom we colloquially wouldn't think of as characters, men like my father who are colorful, elaborate, complicated in ways I could never fully understand. Perhaps that too was why he called my father through the years. A friend, yes, and a New York character, joke telling, street smart, philosophical, worldly, filled, as no doubt Balsam was, by Yiddishkeit. Who knows, perhaps one of his hardest roles was trying not to act like a Jewish guy from the Grand Concourse when he was in Beverly Hills. Perhaps on the phone to New York, he didn't have to. Martin Balsam died while on vacation in Rome in 1995. My father had retired by then, so he didn't book the ticket. He lived until 2017, and once in a while he would say, poor Marty, at least he died in Rome, whatever that means.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Thanks, Joanna.
Beautiful. I love that so much. I want to tell the audience how I knew nothing about the subject matter of this book, and the way this book engrosses me and makes me, for me, it's a page turner, just either because of the prose or because the way you can drive an essay home speaks both to your ability as a writer, but also I think to what the essay can do, that it can create from subject matter that is just totally a world outside me, outside of my knowledge, something that goes into these themes. And I wanted to talk about the way, I wanted to ask you about how this idea of the character actor, how you came to understand that this was a concept that could be a book. And I'd like to pair that with what you said earlier about me, just kind of like an addition to my original question. You said the soul of the essay. So does that make sense? Like,
Sure, yeah.
The idea
Well,
of the book and the
that's
soul of the essay?
that's plenty to start with. I wrote an essay years ago, I mean, a long time ago, about two character actors, about Edward Everett Horton and Jesse Royce Landis. And you know, I thought it was a one-off. And but then you know, it sort of the way things do. I sort of kept thinking about it. There was something that made me want to go back. I wasn't completely satisfied that I had exhausted it, and so exhausted the subject, and so you know, it made me want to go back. There was a world there that you know, that I felt that I had tapped, and so. So I, you know, I started thinking about what was there in character, and you know what the connection was, obviously, between character actor and character more generally.
Yeah.
And but then the book took me much longer to write than I had anticipated. You know, simply because I had to rewatch, you know, hundreds and hundreds of movies. Um, so. So, you know, what I thought was going to be this delightful project that was, you know, going to take a couple of years because, you know, I watch movies all the time anyhow, dragged on and on and on. And so, I mean, in a kind of lovely way, it dragged on and on and on. You know, you know, that's how, you know, that's kind of how the project came about. I mean, I suppose I've been thinking about this on a certain level my whole life because I was fascinated by character actors as a kid, just because my parents seemed to know everybody. when they were watching, I mean, you spent, a bunch of years in Queens, when you were a little kid. And there was this TV channel called WPIX that used to show old movies all the time. And I mean, this was before you were a child there. But my parents would watch this late at night, and they knew everybody. They knew all of these characters, all of these subsidiary characters, and so that I was quite fascinated by this.
That makes sense because my parents are younger than your parents, but my mom was born in 1945, and I know the characters the actors in your book from her, like Cary Grant, Gregory Peck. She was constant, and even the idea of character actor, I don't remember hearing much about it other than my mother being immersed in that world. And she's actually a person who, people who read my book will know, she's extremely like her whole world is religion. And so it's like she was only really interested in film maybe in her 20s, but it continued on even after she stopped watching movies. She would talk to her kids about it. So I can see how that would connect with your family.
Yeah, and I want to circle back around to this idea, the idea of cathexis, because I think the whole idea of cathexis is central to the book. About how early on I had this cathexis with a couple of actors, and you and I talked about this briefly, and I really want to talk about Melina Mercouri and your cathexis with her, and in a way I had a cathexis with her too when I was young, but especially with female actresses, with actresses, and because I think there's this kind of confusing cathexis we have when we're younger, is this also a kind of escape from the family, among other things. But before we get to that, about your book and the essay, let me say, I mean, obviously, your book functions as a memoir on some level, but it doesn't move or think like a memoir, and which is one of the things I really appreciated. Not to give offense to the genre. I mean, can one even do such a thing of the memoir? But I mean, your work moves like essays move in very, very distinct ways, and the individual essays in it very much have their own integrity, but also do a kind of intellectual work that I'm always very, very happy to see in the essay. They're very rangy and aren't satisfied with sort of lyrical invocations of the past. They resist nostalgia constantly. I mean, you're always very, very hard on yourself, doing that great split function that Natalie Serot, was able to talk about, of committing yourself to essentially giving yourself a hard time whenever the nostalgic impulse threatens, and so there was a lot to like in there.
Thank you. I consider myself a disciple of Lydia Facondini, one of an early anthologist of the essay.
Well, I know her anthology backwards and forwards, in fact, and I've for years I've been saying the fact that her anthology has been disused and out of print is just a crime. So yeah,
We have to talk more about this, perhaps a project, but
yeah.
I'm really glad you said that, because I tried to turn my book, as you might imagine, advice was given to me to turn it into a memoir, and I did it, and I hated it. And so many people are like, oh, it's just terms, right? Even like, oh, genre is just a term. And it's very much a relief to me. And I'm so excited that we can do this publicly and argue that there is an enormous difference. And I'm so glad, because that was one of my questions about how, yes, I'm telling the story of a family. Yes, I'm meditating on memory, but I'm not telling, I don't know. Yeah, I don't want to write a memoir. I really love essays, and I'm so happy that you are one of my most admired scholars of the essay. Truth and Nonfiction is just an incredible book.
Well,
and that
thank you.
See it this way.
Yeah, well, because I think the thing is, Joanna, that story is ultimately not primary.
Right.
And I mean, story is important, narrative is important. I mean, but narrative is what you use to think about what's really important.
I really want to
Uh,
just think.
yeah, that's right. That's it. And that shows, throughout the book.
And
So,
that's why your book gives me so much pleasure. It's because it's the moves. And I was telling you, I was like, I don't care about this topic at all, but I love this book because I love the way it moves and I love the way you get towards and you hunt for that, the deeper meaning. I sound like I'm in class right now, but the deeper meaning that the students say. I'm always like, okay, guys, you have to find something, go deeper, and don't be satisfied. I was invited to withdraw from class in my senior year, a literary right after. So I took Lydia Facandini's The Art of the Essay. She accepted students only by application. And she asked me which class do you want? And I said, both. And she said, that's a lot of Facandini. And I said, I know when I can learn from somebody. I was like, I have found my teacher. And this was 2000. And that was what I wanted to do. And my mind started working like an essayist. And the next semester, I kept undermining my own argument in a regular literature class. And the professor was like, you just need to write essays. You don't need this class. I wanted to ask you how your essayistic eye on the topic of the essays. I was thinking, did the process of thinking so hard about character influence the way you thought about yourself as a character within the essay and your essayistic persona?
um, yeah, I think, the short answer is yes, I think so. I mean, I think that I'm a quirky essay narrator. I think I'm always, a sort of a character, as it were, in my essays. I'm not an essayist who's recessive in my speaking of the essays. I mean, I'm very much there. I mean, at times, overbearing. I'm digressive and hyperactive, and funny, and so I knew I was going to have to come to terms with how that at some point the finger was going to turn towards me. I mean, how do I how I mean, how does character speak to my sense of self, in other words? So I think I did that in places.
Excellent. So do you want to talk about Melina Mercuri and what you
Of
said in
course.
the last compromise in business? Like our conversation about Mercuri what I've written about Mercuri will dovetail with what you were thinking about, right? And what we as writers also think about, like de-romanticizing art. Sometimes I'm like, my next book, I'm like, I got to write the book so that I can make money. Almost like for me, it's reducing the stakes, but also anyway, the artistic compromises that especially our character actors have made.
Right. Well. First of all, I really I could have looked this up, I suppose, but I wanted to ask you about it. First of all, I mean, I'm one of the things I'm fascinated by in terms of Melina Mercuri is there is, in fact, I mean, not just to be jokey about it, but there is something mercurial about her sexuality, and right because. Especially in Stella and in Never on Sunday. I mean, she's playing hypererotic characters. I mean, she's playing the role of the prostitute, obviously, and which is problematic and transgressive and interesting, but she's doing it in. I think one of the things that's really interesting about her is the way she does it in this, with this. Slightly untouchable way. Um,
I'm so happy I found an American. I can't believe I found an American who's seen Stella.
oh yeah, yeah. Well, Stella's an important film, I think, for the mid-50s. I mean,
Yeah.
in terms of just complicated, well, violence toward women, but also women who have portray a really complicated sexuality, right? On film. And it's also very, very interesting to me that, Mercuri, I think didn't she share the acting prize with Jean Moreau? I think she did, and I think they co-won it, and which is very, very interesting. I think in 1960 for Never on Sunday, and which is very, very interesting because and signals this very interesting sea change. Because both have this there is this elusiveness in very different ways for both of them. But anyhow.
So compromises and the ways in which we are able to look at the character actors and the stories of these actors, were you able to think about art and the ways in which we idealize art and artistic choices sometimes, and then can look at it in a more practical way and think about how we accuse artists of not being pure in their art? Like I wrote about, and people, when everybody who knows I write about Mercury, they're like constantly giving me reasons why she shouldn't be as lauded as she is. And they're like, she's not as much of a hero as she is. And it's like, that's sort of the definition of the hero, the person who doesn't live up to who they are thought to be.
Right, but you see, in that sense, she sort of fits into, for me, what I was trying to get at in my discussion of this bunch of
Yeah.
women who get thrown over for younger women, but wonderful, attractive, sexually mature women. Eleanor Parker, Celeste Holm, obviously, Nina Folk, Eve Arden. They all have, this complicated sexuality, mature sexuality, and invariably, they get tossed over for ingenue, these virginal, women, right? Because a sexually mature woman is just too scary, right? And that's part of the critique, though, of
Yes.
Mercury. I think she's simply too powerful.
And people don't like it. Yes, that leads into another point I wanted to make. I was going to disguise it as a question and say, how did you manage?
No, talk. I want to hear you talk.
What I love, the other thing that I really love, and we just don't see enough in, male identified writers, I love the feminism of this book. It was just a delight every time you said it. I was going to say, how do you manage to not be preachy? That is a genuine question that I have, right? How do you as an essayist pull off what is very much an analysis, right? And that's a question about the whole book. You're doing film criticism and film analysis. You're making a very important feminist argument about the way over and over again, there's this pattern of much hotter, let's just say it frankly, much hotter women being ignored. And the storyline, the narrative insists that what the person who is desirable is the unthreatening young woman, who I don't find as attractive either. How do you manage to make those evident and powerful arguments essayistically, in the sense that the reader doesn't feel preached to and it doesn't come off as argumentative, thesis-driven scholarship?
Right. Well, I mean, two things. So number one, I mean, you're writing from your enthusiasms, and I mean, I'm not just writing film theory after all. I mean, in some of the same ways that you do in your book. I mean, your book is also an intellectual autobiography, and right. I mean, because you're writing about how you at first, for example, like with the Jonathan Culler stuff. At first, you avoided theory, and then you discover theory. I mean, so there's a lot of that. I mean, you do it through the language, right? I mean, it's all about not falling into the trap of language that's cliched or academic
or transparent prose, right? Because this is another thing I want to insist, that this is creative writing that thinks, right? And that's another problem I think in our field is we don't have enough books like this. I really don't think that we have enough work that demonstrates that something can be both this literary and this intellectual, right?
Yeah. So, you know, I describe my prose sometimes as being neurotic prose. So that's really all you have to do is, you know, let your, you know, I mean, take your neurotic self into your prose and, you know, let them, you let them dance together. Yeah.
The neuroticism leads me to a question about ending the book with your father. When did you realize, or what was the process of realizing, because that the crescendo would be so much? I mean, I think the audience will have heard in that essay that you were able to read in its entirety because it's so compact, the way that your family story, your discovery of yourself as your parents' child, merges with and almost reveals, in some sense, the investigation of character to actually, but not actually, not entirely, be a way of understanding the father. When do you figure that out?
Right. Right. Well, I mean, it's, you know, it's that sense of, uh, you know, which you understand too, of, you know, trying so hard, one tries so hard for so long to escape until one realizes that the only way I'm going to be able to, you know, to escape my fate as my parents' children is, you know, is to sort of dive in. You know, and to embrace, you know, those, you know, familiar parts of me that, you know, that are in fact inescapable. I mean, that's the only way out, you know. and and so, you know, and then, you know, so then you wade in, and you know, it's it's not so, you know, that's not so easy, as you know. You know, it means going places that that perhaps, you know, opening doors you don't necessarily want to open, you know, et cetera. But otherwise, you know, the alternative is just a kind of stuckness, I think, don't you think?
Yes, absolutely. That stuckness. I sometimes, and that's why readers are helpful. I always say that, are both to my students and to friends, like, the problem we really need to write about is here, and then I go right up to it, and I stop here, and then I'm like, I can feel the thing I don't want to write about is right there. So I start going off in all these other directions, and then I get here, so I'm pointing towards it, but I can't deal with it. I can't see it. So I need somebody to read it and be like, this is this thing that you don't want to talk about. I
Yeah.
also showed the narrative to a friend. It had a lot more of my childhood in it because a professor made me write about my childhood, and it was there. So I stuck it in the book. And then I hadn't come out to my mom. This was right. The coming out story occurred in wait, I'm losing track. I think 2018. It was a few months shy of my 40th birthday. So it was August of 2018. So I started this book in 2005. So I've been writing the book for 13 years and, you know, ready to be done. And a friend of mine who's a fiction writer says, this book doesn't work unless it raises the expectation of you're coming out to your mother, because you spend the book worried about what your parents are going to think. You bury your father, you don't have to deal with that anymore, and you're kind of like, okay, I got through that. Now how do I? And so even not only in the narrative, but even in our lives, sometimes our books require that we go places we don't want to go.
Right, right, absolutely. Well, you know, well, a couple of things. You know, I love the letter to your father essay, and also I love the, you know, the way you tap into your literary history, the Ginsberg, and the letter to your father obviously raises the specter of Kafka, you know, and his letter to his father, right? And I was thinking, you know, when I was, you know, reading it, of one of my favorite lines. It's one of my favorite lines in the world. It's Lacan, and the line is, "The letter is always delivered."
Hmm.
Uh, you know, whether it's sent or not, on some level or not, the letter is always delivered, because it's a wonderful epistolary essay, that essay to your father. And so anyhow, The other thing I wanted to mention, by the way, I love the way, and it's another little thing we share. I love your mentions in the book of A.R. Ammons, who actually was very important to me when I was young. No, I worked with him for a bit, and
Where?
at Cornell for a summer.
Okay.
And he sort of sent me on my way in this very important way. He was one of those people who gave me permission, you know.
Yes.
And so I was pretty delighted to see him in there.
I served him coffee, and Norton very graciously allowed me to use his poem. So it's such a good memory. Where are we? I don't see any questions. I would love to start getting some questions if people would like to start sending us some questions.
Yeah, that's great, Joanna. Thanks. I'm just chiming in. If folks have questions, if you want to enter them now, that'd be great. And Joanna, if you have any other talking points, please do continue until something pops up in the Q&A. This is delightful.
I did have this is sort of just a non-literary note. My mom said how could anybody in Bernie's accent said, how could anybody vote for Bernard Sanders? So my mom did not get rid of her Brooklyn accent,
That's
but
great.
does ask how anybody could possibly. I can only, my New York accent comes out obviously when I'm talking to somebody else who has a New York accent.
Yeah. No, you know, my problem with Bernie Sanders was he reminded me of like a Brooklyn uncle of mine, and the idea of being lectured by him with that finger for 4 years, you know, just seemed impossible to me. I didn't know how I could stand it.
Which is, I just wanted that. That's what I wanted. Because it does, for me, it kind of skips a generation, right? For me, there was a nostalgic factor. Both I agree with his principles, but also it was like, oh, he sounds like home. Why does it bother you? I read that you originally planned to come up to the present day. I also had to figure out, right? I was told by a friend, and she was right, that I had to move the end of the essays the chronology of the book as a whole had to end after I came out to my mom. But then I continued to work on it a little bit. Things kept happening. I was like, nope, can't put that in. How did you figure out that chronologically the container was fairly tight, right? It is
Right.
this golden age.
Yeah. Well, my original plan had been to end, actually, I had planned to end with an essay on Philip Seymour Hoffman.
Right.
Because I thought he was, you know, in some ways the apotheosis of the character actor as sort of star, and plus he's simply endlessly interesting. And but I felt it would have sort of thrown the book sort of off kilter. I mean, all of this sort of mid-century, you know, Hollywood, and then this, you know, indie contemporary actor. It just wouldn't quite have worked. So, you know, I might still write the essay, but I didn't say. You know, I thought, as you know, as a sort of shorter book that had a very specific focus, it made sense. And then it also made sense then as a kind of homage to my childhood. And so yeah. People always want to direct you though on you know, what to do with your book. It's amazing.
And I think I tell my workshop students, part of becoming a writer is figuring out what the good advice and what isn't. There's the other side in my book is the very first essay I wrote, the very first submission I made to my MFA workshop back in 2005. And I was very resistant to the restructuring that somebody suggested. And I did it. I submitted it like I said, like, his name was Scott Anderson's like style of revision. It was like all resistant, and people were like, oh, it really works. As you know, sometimes ideas, you know, other people's ideas that we resist do work. And yeah.
Yeah,
I'm-
I had an example of that in my
Yeah.
first book, Body of Brooklyn. Iowa came back after they had taken the book. They came back to me and they said, "Well, we want an essay about your brother." And I said, "What do you mean you want an essay about? I mean, I don't work that way. I mean, why not tell me you want an essay about my dog?" Uh, and so I went to work in it, and it actually turned out to be one of my favorite essays in the book. So, I mean, even advice that's not necessarily the best advice somehow can work out. Yeah.
Yeah. And if I were so lucky as to have people study my manuscript, I would love to see if I don't think that I can figure out the differences. Right. It was an essay collection for several years. Then I made it a memoir in the summer of 2017. And then I returned to it as an essay collection. What insights, I'm sure some insights are, I want to believe that some insights came out of producing the memoir. Megan Daum calls what is needed to turn an essay collection into a memoir gratuitous connective tissue, right? It's a really good term. She says that she regrets, I think it's the book, My Life Would Be Perfect If I Lived in That House, the way it was demanded of her that she turn an essay collection into a memoir. She did that, and I can see it. I don't see the essay collection, but that we create something that we don't quite want to do, but then it leads to insights.
Exactly. Yeah.
Hi, folks. Sorry to surprise
Hi.
you. I think it's a good place to wrap up. I just wanted to say how appreciative I am of both of you for joining us and everyone
Thank you,
watching this evening. Yeah, of course. It's been a real pleasure. We're across 3 different time zones, and so I'm really glad we could all be together. Thank you for your insight and your time, and for your wonderful conversation. It was really a privilege.
Thank you, Karin. Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you, David, for inviting me. Thank you for hosting us, and thank you for selling books.
Yes.
No
Buy
problem.
Joanna's book, everyone.
Please do.
From Green Apple Books. Thank
Yes.
you.
Bye.
Good night, folks.
Good night. Oh,